Okay, welcome to our second meeting of child psychology. As you guys remember, I am Dr. Freddy Aviles. Okay, we're moving right on to chapter 3. As I said, we're skipping those first two chapters that are kind of just introductory chapters, you know, stuff we don't really have to get into. We have a lot of things to cover, so we'll start with genetics. And that is, you know, kind of a, you know, not a slow start. So we're getting into real information that you have to know. But the good news is that it's not that bad. If you've taken any basic science class or any biology class, you probably have heard about this already. As a matter of fact, a lot of this is common knowledge now. Genetics is a field of its own, and it's advancing very rapidly. We're only going to cover basics here. We're not going to get into anything that's really that new or complicated. A lot of this stuff you guys already know, so let's just get right into it. So we're going to talk about all of this stuff. This is the chapter overview. And notice that the bullets there and, you know, my numbering there, it seems kind of a bit off. I see a little N there and the little bullets are off to the side. For some reason, when I present in PowerPoint, on my iPad, it moves things around a little bit. So you'll see things like that, but when you download the lecture, it will have the right numbers and everything will be spaced correctly. And sometimes there'll be pictures that will be cutting off some of the words when you see me presenting it here. But when you download it, it won't be that way. I don't know why it does this on the iPad. But eventually I will be switching to a laptop and that won't be an issue. Okay, so we're going to talk about genetics, just these things that you guys have heard about before, DNA, genes, chromosomes, and some other things about how some of this stuff works. A little bit about reproduction at the cellular level, okay? And that's what the lecture will be. So let's keep going. That's just an outline. Okay, genetics. First, a definition of what the study of genetics is. Okay, so the study of genetics, genetics is the study of the genetic makeup of individuals and its influence on physical and behavior characteristics. So it's a study all of its own, okay? The study of our genetic makeup and how that affects, you know, us physically and even our behavior. It is related to psychology because psychology is about behavior as well. Actually, genetics affects everything. Okay, it affects your biology, and your biology affects, you know, your thinking. It affects your emotions. It affects your behavior. So genetics is related to psychology. Okay, so we need to talk a little bit about it. Okay, all of you have probably heard about DNA before. DNA is just chemical information containing these four chemicals: adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. You don't have to know a whole bunch of details about this, but those are the four base pairs for DNA. Some of you may have heard that DNA basically looks like a twisted ladder. And the combinations of these chemicals basically, you know, forms the steps of those ladders, of that ladder, okay? So DNA is, actually, you can think of it as like the instructions or a blueprint to manufacture proteins. And then, of course, the proteins are the ones that basically you know, create the physical structures needed for a living thing. Okay, so DNA is found in every cell nucleus, and so it's found in every cell, and cells make up everything about a human being. Cells make up all living things. Okay, all living things are made of cells. Okay, whether you're talking about a human being or an animal or a plant, all living things are made of cells. And cells make up everything about living things. Your organs, your bones, your skin, your blood, everything. Your hair, your nails, it's all made of cells. Okay? And cells have DNA. And DNA is like basically the instructions for making that living thing. A little bit about the genetic code. The genetic code, so basically you know, we have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Okay? 46, okay, individual chromosomes, okay, and there's about 21,000 genes in the human genome, okay, about 21,000 genes that direct, you know, specific protein formation and, you know, from 20 amino acids, okay, and there's about 3 billion base pairs of these four chemicals. So if you think of DNA as a twisted ladder, okay, and each step of the ladder is basically a pair of those chemicals, then in a human being, you'll have about 3 billion steps to that ladder. that DNA ladder. Now let me show you some, let me tell you a little bit more about that, and then I'll show you some images, okay? Let's talk about something called methylation, okay? A fancy word that means that basically the genetic information can be enhanced, okay? It can be copied, it can be connected, it can be empowered, it can be silenced or even altered. So if you want to think about this simply, it means that basically genes, you know, genetic information basically can be turned on and off. Sometimes it can be made more active or less active, and that's called methylation. Both RNA and DNA can alter those genetic instructions, okay? You know, copying it, that means transcribing it, right? And RNA regulates and transcribes the genetic information. So that's a fancy word, methylation, that basically means the altering of this genetic information in various ways, turning things on and off, empowering them, silencing things, muting things, things like that. And epigenetics is the study of basically of how environmental factors affect genes and the expression of those genes. It enhances, the environment can enhance, halt, shape, or even alter the expression of genes, okay? So turning things on and off, things being copied, muted, whatever, doesn't just happen at the genetic level, at the biological level. The environment also has an effect on that. So here's an example of that, if you can see right there. It's an example. It says genes for artistic expression. So maybe you're born with the genes to be an artist, for instance, for artistic expression, and you have that innate, that inborn tendency. It's genetic. But in the household that you grow up in, and let's say in the kind of education that you get, even at school, doesn't emphasize, you know, that artistic tendency. You're not exposed to music, let's say, and dance and painting, or, you know, or whatever it is, you know, that artistic tendency is not nurtured. So what will happen is that you're not going to develop your artistic tendency, and you'll still be a little bit more artistic, let's say, than the average person, perhaps, you know, who hasn't had any training. But you won't become an artist. You won't develop those skills to the extent that this would be one of your strengths. Okay, to the extent that you can make a career out of it. That's an example. Okay, I'm one of those people that wasn't exposed to much artistic stuff growing up. Luckily for me, I don't think I have the genes for artistic expression. I'm very logical in my thinking. Okay, keep going. A little bit more about genes and chromosomes and sex chromosomes. So let's talk about you know, how, you know, what's contained in what. Okay, so let's talk about basically degrees here. You know, like genes, for instance, are actual segments of DNA. We talked about what DNA is. It's genetic information. And then genetic information is contained in genes. So genes are basically a piece, a segment of DNA. Okay, when you have a bunch of DNA, a specific part of it that actually does something, that would be called a gene, okay? So genes are segments of DNA that direct the synthesis of proteins and enzymes. And as I said before, proteins are necessary to create and develop those physiological structures, and then the behavior that results from that, okay? And then genes are contained in chromosomes. So chromosomes are even larger. Chromosomes are these structures that look like rods. They contain genes, several genes, okay? And each human being has, you know, 23 pairs of chromosomes, or 46 chromosomes, 46 individual chromosomes, okay? So DNA is contained in genes, and genes are contained in chromosomes. And we have sex chromosomes, okay? What we call the 23rd pair of chromosomes are called the sex chromosomes. These are the chromosomes that are responsible for you being male or female. So there are the sex chromosomes are the X and Y chromosomes that determine sex. So as you guys know, females are XX. They have two X chromosomes, sex chromosomes, right? And males are XY, okay? The Y chromosome, believe it or not, is smaller than the X chromosome. And it just looks basically like a piece of the X chromosome was cut off or something. So it's a smaller chromosome, and you need that Y in order to be a male. If that Y is missing, you are going to be a female, okay? So the sex chromosomes will determine your sex. And we'll talk about in a moment how, you know, sometimes things don't work out as planned, okay? let's keep going. Let's look at an image here so you can understand. So there you see, starting on the left, you see an image of a cell with the nucleus kind of in the middle there. Inside that nucleus, you have chromosomes, 23 pairs of them, or 46 chromosomes, okay? And if you enlarge one of those, there's one that looks like an X, okay? It looks somewhat like that. And then if you take a piece of that chromosome, that will be a gene. And then of course, inside the gene, you have these specific base pairs of genetic information, the DNA, right? So DNA is contained in genes, genes are contained in chromosomes, chromosomes are contained in the nucleus, and the nucleus is contained in the cell. And cells make up everything about living organisms, okay? Anything that's alive is made of cells. Okay, let's keep going. A little bit about how genes work, okay? So you guys have probably heard about a lot of this stuff before, you know, well, if you haven't, here it is, okay? So there are these things called alleles. Alleles are just different forms of a gene, okay? So here's the thing, genes come in different forms. So genes, for instance, can be homozygous, okay? So here's the thing, let's use eye color as an example, okay? When it comes to eye color, you get one gene from your mom and one gene from your dad, okay? And if your genes are, if you have homozygous alleles, that means you have the same version of the gene. For example, you know, you could be big B for brown eyes, okay? So if you have the gene for brown eyes, that is written as a big B, a capital B. So if you got that form of gene from your mother, and that same form of the gene, that same gene, I should say, from your mother and your father, okay? If you got them from both, the same version of the gene, right? Then that means you are homozygous for brown eyes, okay? Now, if you have different versions of the gene, that's called heterozygous, okay? You have different alleles for eye color. So you got the big B for brown eyes, let's say from your mother, and then you got the little b for little b stands for blue eyes, actually, the little b from your father. No, I said okay, yeah, the brown eyes, the big B from your mother, and the little b from your mother. So you are heterozygous. You have different versions of the gene for eye color. You got a blue eye gene from your mother. You got a brown eye gene from your mother, I should say, to keep it consistent, and a blue eye gene from your father. You would still have brown eyes because brown eyes are dominant. That's another thing we have to know about genes, is sometimes they are dominant. The dominant gene overpowers the recessive gene. So the big B, the reason the gene for brown eyes is written in capital letter as a big B is because it's dominant, okay? If it's dominant, it's written in as a capital letter, okay? And if the gene is recessive, it's written in a lowercase. So little b for blue eyes. The blue eyes are recessive. So brown eyes are dominant. So if you get the brown eye gene from one of your parents and the blue eye gene from the other parent, you will usually have brown eyes because the brown eye overpowers the blue eye gene. Now this is the way it kind of works. Eye color has to do with melanin, which is the same thing that actually makes your skin darker, okay? If you get more melanin in your eyes will be darker and basically they'll be brown, okay? And the more melanin, the darker brown, okay? So the brown eye gene, okay, which we basically, you know, label that as big B because it's dominant. The brown eye gene basically says, let's give this person a lot of melanin in his or her eyes. And the blue eye gene, little b, says, let's give this person only a little bit. So what happens if you mix a lot of melanin with a little bit? You still have a lot, so you will still have brown eyes, okay? Now, if you get two recessive genes, let's say two blue eye genes, then, you know, then basically one gene says, let's give this person a little bit of melanin, and the other one says, let's give this person a little bit of melanin. So you have a little bit. So you'll usually have blue eyes, okay? Now, being heterozygous for brown eyes, meaning you have a brown eye gene and a blue eye gene, doesn't always give you exactly brown eyes. Sometimes you have a stronger version or a weaker version of the brown eye gene. So you can have hazel eyes, for instance, and that usually means you have a brown eye gene and a blue eye gene, but the brown eye gene wasn't strong enough to completely overpower the blue eye gene. Okay, that's what I've noticed. It's sometimes you can get a very strong brown eye gene that gives you a lot of melanin, and sometimes you get one that is still dominant but not as strong and doesn't give you as much melanin. That's the case with my children. My wife has blue eyes. She has 2 blue eye genes, recessive, and I have brown eyes. Okay, and I know from looking at my children that you know, basically I don't have a blue eye gene. Okay, because otherwise I would have gotten, you know, I had a chance for a blue-eyed child, but I don't have one. So what happened is my son basically got a brown eye gene from me and a blue eye gene from his mother, and he has brown eyes, very dark brown eyes. He got a very strong version of my brown eye gene. And my daughter, she got a brown eye gene from me and a blue eye gene from her mother. However, the brown eye gene she got from me wasn't strong enough to completely overpower the blue eye gene. So she got some melanin, but not a whole bunch. And she ended up with eyes that are basically, they look a little brown, a little green, a little yellow, depending on the lighting. So, you know, but she still has a brown eye gene and a blue eye gene. It's just that she got a weaker version of my blue eye gene, but it's still a dominant gene. It's just, it's a little bit more complicated in practice is what I'm saying, as this, it's not as simple as this makes it out to be. Okay, so my daughter was actually born with blue eyes, and then her eyes got darker, you know, as the brown eye gene was expressed a little bit more, but her eyes didn't turn completely brown. Sometimes genes can be co-dominant, okay? You know, the alleles can be co-dominant, which means that they're equally dominant. And that's what we have with blood type, okay? Blood type A and blood type B are co-dominant, which means one isn't stronger than the other. So if you get the blood type A from your mother, blood type B from your father, you will have blood type AB, which is very rare, actually, only about 3% of the population. There's also blood type O, which is recessive. If you get the blood type A gene from your mother and the blood type O gene from your father, you will have blood type A because O is recessive. Same thing with, similar thing with B. If you get the gene for blood type B from your mother and gene for blood type O from your father, you will have blood type B. Okay, in order to have blood type O, you need the type O gene, the gene for blood type O from both your mother and your father. Okay, sometimes genes are additive. Okay, and genes can combine, can give you an average. That's what happens with height. Okay, tall and short genes. Let's say your father, for instance. Let's say it this way. Okay, let's say your father is tall, really tall, like 6'5" or something like that. And your mother is short. She's only like 5'4" or something like that, or 5'3". What's going to happen is that the resulting offspring would be about average height. Okay, taller than mother, but not as tall as dad. So maybe, I don't know, maybe 5'10", maybe 5'9", or 6 feet or something like that. But you tend to get a sort of average. Okay, a similar thing happens with skin color. Okay, you can have one parent that has a lot of melanin in his or her skin, and they have darker skin, another parent that's very light skinned. And when they have children, usually what happens is you get a child that is in between both of them when it comes to skin color. Now, it doesn't always work out that way, okay? Because there's a lot of diversity in people's genes. I'll give you an example from, about Latinos. Latinos actually have a lot of diversity in their genes. Most Latinos actually are mixed. They have European ancestry, and they also have indigenous ancestry. So basically, and some of them actually have, European and African ancestry. So they can have a mixture of genes. Actually, Latinos, believe it or not, are not even considered a race. It's a mixture of different people. So it's possible for 2 Latinos, for instance, to have a child, and let's say they're both dark-skinned, and they can have a light-skinned child. That does happen. It doesn't happen often, but it does happen. Or for 2 light-skinned parents, or average-skinned parents, to have a child that's a little bit darker than they are. It's possible to get other combinations, is what I'm saying. But usually skin color, height, things like that, and other genes, some of them combine in an additive form, which means that you get an average, okay? Let's move on. More about genetics. expression of these genes. Okay, here's the thing. You have to know these two different terms here. Difference between a genotype and a phenotype. A genotype is basically your genetic makeup. Okay, it's what genes you have. Okay, for instance, you could be big B for brown eyes, or big B, little b for brown eyes. Okay, both big B and big B mean you have brown eyes, and big B, little b would also give you brown eyes. Okay, because the brown eye gene is dominant. Or big B, little b for blue eyes. Okay, that would be your genotype. Okay, that's your genetic makeup. Now your phenotype, however, that's the outward expression. Okay, that's what you see, the physical appearance, or maybe even the behavior. Okay, so your genotype, for instance, can be big B, little b. So you have that genotype, and then you have brown eye color. That would be the phenotype. Okay, so big B, little b can be your genotype, and then brown eye color can be your phenotype. Okay, so phenotype just means the expression. Genotype is your genetic makeup. Okay, and you have to know how these genes kind of combine to affect the phenotype. So you see over here on the right, you see that little square there? That's called a Punnett square. And what you can do is you can put the genotype of, let's say, the mother on the top and the father on the side here. And it kind of works a little bit like your multiplication table, but it's not really multiplication. So you can combine big B, and that first square right there at the upper left, and then big B, little b on the upper right, and then big B, little b on the lower left, and then big B, little b on the lower right. Those are your possibilities for those genotypes. So what we have here is that the mother has brown eyes and the father has brown eyes, but they both have a blue-eyed gene. The chances, and these are the possibilities for their children as far as eye color. There's only a 1/4 chance, a 25% chance that they will have a blue-eyed baby, okay? And there's a 3/4 chance that they will have a brown-eyed baby, okay? But let's say there's a 50% chance that they'll have a brown-eyed baby with heterozygous alleles for brown eyes, or heterozygous alleles, okay, for eye color. And there's a 1/4 chance, a 25% chance that they'll have a brown-eyed baby with homozygous allies for eye color. Okay, you have to know things like this. It'll be on your homework, and hopefully this little example makes it clear. A lot of you probably already know about this, but at the end, once I stop the lecture, on the whiteboard, I will do a little something like this, just to make it clear in case it isn't. Okay, I will do another example. Okay, with eye color to make it simple. Okay, because this might not be perfectly clear, but I'll make it clear for you guys. Okay, moving on. Here's some images for you guys. And as you can see there on the left, we have an albino skunk, right? Skunks are not usually that color, right? They're usually, mostly black with a white stripe. So that's an albino skunk. Because you don't see these skunks very much, they're rare. That probably means that the gene that makes a skunk an albino is probably recessive. We have somebody there at the upper right with, curly hair. Now, I don't know if that was permed or not, but she looked like she had her hair done. But curly hair, the point about that is that curly hair, believe it or not, is due to a recessive gene. The gene for straight hair is actually dominant, okay? And then we have at the bottom somebody curling their tongue in a U shape, or kind of making a taco shell with their tongue. That is due to a dominant gene, okay? If you can curl your tongue like that, then you have the dominant gene for tongue curling, I guess. Now, I'm one of those people that cannot do that. I cannot curl my tongue that way, no matter how hard I try. And that means that I have basically recessive genes for tongue curling. I got a recessive gene from my mother and one from my father, so both recessive genes. Okay, and these are just some examples of recessive genes, basically, and how they appear. Or not just recessive genes, but recessive and dominant genes and the effects they can have. Okay, so remember, the expression is the phenotype. Moving on. Now, genetic information can be altered, okay? It can be changed. And sometimes that happens because of spontaneous mutations, okay? Mutations are basically changes in the genetic information. It changes in the DNA, okay? And if they occur spontaneously, it means that you can't really predict when they're gonna happen. They happen every now and then, and it could be due to maybe radiation. It could be due just an error in copying of the genetic information, or what seems to be no reason at all. They are spontaneous mutations, okay? They happen. The genetic information is altered every now and then. It changes, sometimes for no reason. Spontaneous mutations are influenced by the age of the mother and also the father. If the mother is over age 35, she will have, she's more prone to having spontaneous mutations or changes in the genetic information, and passing those on, okay, to her offspring. For the father, if the father is over age 40, then he's more prone to having these mutations, these alterations, these changes to his genetic information. These mutations, these changes in genetic information can be helpful, okay? They can also be harmful, or sometimes they're harmless. Sometimes they make no difference at all. Of course, the important ones are the mutations that are actually harmful, okay? Most of them are actually harmless, but sometimes they're harmful. We'll talk about some of those. And, you know, rarely are they helpful, but it does happen. Okay, so let's talk about, you know, when things can actually go wrong. Let's talk about genetic disorders. Let's talk about problems that have to do with genetic information that actually lead to harm, okay? Alterations in genetic information. So they can happen in two levels. They can happen at the genetic level, and when there are defective genes, alterations in the genetic information, and they lead to a problem, that will be a genetic disorder, okay? They're caused by defective genes, and those defects can be due to alterations, spontaneous mutations, or other things. An example of that will be Tay-Sachs disease, a disease that leads to the destruction of basically of cells in the spinal cord and the brain. And eventually, if it's untreated, actually results in death. It's a devastating disease. If I recall correctly, even with treatment, those that have Tay-Sachs disease usually die by age 4. It's a really awful thing to have. Sickle cell anemia is actually very common. Not sickle cell anemia. Yeah, sickle cell anemia is a disorder that can be common among people who have African descent, common among people who are African Americans. And sickle cell anemia basically results in you feeling weak and tired, and some other symptoms. But it basically means your blood cells, rather than having a nice kind of round shape, are shaped like a sickle. They have an indentation, you know, and basically they're not as good as transporting oxygen, which means that basically you'll be a little bit more tired, more sleepy. You won't feel as good, okay? Now, the interesting thing is that sickle cell anemia also has some benefits. It turns out, according to research, that those that have sickle cell anemia are actually less vulnerable to malaria, which is actually quite common in places like Africa and some places in South America. So it's actually advantageous in places like that to have you know, this defective gene, but also leads to other problems. PKU is another disorder that leads to problems, another genetic disorder. It's basically the inability to break down a chemical known as phenylalanine, which, you know, if left untreated, and it's treated through changes in diet, if left untreated, will result in basically damage to the brain, and then learning problems down the road and lower intelligence, things like that. It's something you want to get treated, okay? And they can test for that. They can do genetic tests, okay? And now there's also chromosomal disorders. These are disorders that are at the chromosome level. It usually means that maybe there's an extra chromosome or there's one missing, okay? But there's a problem at the chromosomal level. Now there's some interesting chromosomal disorders like Klinefelter syndrome. Klinefelter syndrome is a problem that has to do with 20, 23rd pair of chromosomes. Remember, the 23rd pair is the pair of chromosomes that determines your sex, whether you're going to be male or female. Those that have Klinefelter syndrome don't just have 2 of those sex chromosomes, or they don't just have 2, they have 3. So basically they have XXY. Klinefelter syndrome, they have XXY. It's possible to have XXX, but that's another thing, okay? That I don't remember the name of that, but Klinefelter syndrome is XXY. So these are individuals that have an extra sex chromosome, and they have XXY. And because they have the Y, that means that these individuals are genetically males. The Y chromosome basically turns you into a male. It makes you male, okay? But they also have 2 X's, okay? So there can be some problems here. They tend to be infertile. They can't reproduce. And they require hormonal treatment at puberty to inhibit those female characteristics. So what happens is that, you know, they can't reproduce. So basically, as they get older, they'll be genetically male, but as they get older, you know, and they start puberty, they will get too much female hormone and they'll start developing breasts. So they need hormones or actually treatments that inhibit those female hormones so they can look more normal, I guess more like a male because they are genetically male. That's Klinefelter syndrome. Turner syndrome is another chromosomal disorder that has to do with sex that's also very interesting. And it's XO, that's the genotype. And what that means is that there's 1 X and then there's nothing else. The O there, or the 0, if you want to call it that, means that there's no other X, there's no Y, there's just 1 X. So those with Turner syndrome are female, okay? Because, you know, there's no Y, so you're a female. If the Y is missing, you're a female. So they tend to be female, they're infertile, they can't reproduce, and they tend to be short and also overweight, by the way. So they tend to be kind of short and kind of pudgy, and they're infertile. And they also tend to be hyper feminine. They're very stereotypically feminine. So they'll really love jewelry and makeup and playing with dolls, be very docile, not aggressive at all. It's basically, they are considered like hyper females, okay? They only have 1 X, so they have no testosterone whatsoever. They get no testosterone, which means they are hyper feminine. But they're also infertile, and you know, there is treatment for Turner syndrome. When they get older and they are around the time of puberty, they can get hormonal treatment so they can get their periods, but they'll still be infertile, just to make them feel more normal, okay? I have a cousin whose daughter actually has Turner syndrome, and yeah, she has all the characteristics. She's short, just, you know, she's overweight, trouble, you know, well, she's overweight, okay? Trouble with that, you know, and I suppose she's gonna, you know, that she's infertile. But otherwise, other than that, she is normal, and intelligence is normal. But, you know, that's Turner syndrome, kind of, you know, the hyper females, what that's called. 1 X, and then no other, the other sex chromosome is missing. And then we have the hyper male or the super male, XYY syndrome, okay? These are males because they have you know, they have a Y, so they'll be males. Remember, the Y makes you a male. They tend to be tall, okay? They have an extra Y, so they'll get more testosterone than the average male. They tend to be tall, they tend to have more acne, they tend to be more aggressive, more antisocial, and have more problems with the law, okay? They are fertile, they can reproduce, and they also have slightly lower intelligence. Being that, you know, hyper male, that stereotypical super male, you can say, basically means you're gonna be tall, bigger, maybe, you know, wider shoulders, more aggressive, but also less intelligent. Being too masculine is not a good thing, I guess you can say. Okay, but that's the XYY syndrome, the so-called hyper male. And then we have Down syndrome, which is not a, it's not a chromosomal disorder that affects sex. It's a chromosomal disorder where there's an extra chromosome. The 21st pair of chromosomes, rather than being two of those, there are 3. And here's more information about Down syndrome. It's also called trisomy 21 because the 21st, what should be the 21st pair, there's an extra one. So there's 3 of the 21st what would be the 21st pair of chromosomes. That wouldn't make it a pair, but there's trisomy 21, 3 for the 21st, okay? So Down syndrome, also called trisomy 21, right? It involves about 300 or so distinct characteristics, okay? And it, you know, you can see this child over here in the front wearing the green shirt there. There's certain characteristics that that sort of make them stand out, okay? They have almond-shaped eyes, you know, they tend to have a round face, a thick tongue. They have a smaller brain, smaller hippocampus, and that affects memory. They'll have lower intelligence, so they'll have intellectual problems, language problems, and they all look kind of similar, even if they're unrelated. You know, genetically, I mean, if they're unrelated, okay, they don't come from the same parents, you get a group of them together, and you'll see that they all look similar. They also tend to have thicker necks, okay? And, you know, that's kind of what they look like, okay? And that's a chromosomal disorder, which means they have 3 of the would otherwise be the 21st pair. 3, they have an extra copy of that. And it's, you know, well, they do tend to be kind of happy, but, you know, they are impaired intellectually. They have, you know, intelligence is a lot lower. They, you know, they will need accommodations. They are disabled. Okay, moving on, some more information about genes. Nature and nurture interact. So it turns out that your genetics, your biology, and the environment interact. We already mentioned that. We mentioned epigenetics, which is the study of that. But speaking more specifically about other disorders, some disorders are, you know, involve both nature and nurture, both the gene and the environment. And one of those examples is what we call alcohol use disorder. Commonly known as alcoholism. Alcoholism is genetic, okay? Some people are more prone to becoming alcoholics than others, okay? So the genes create an addictive pool, right? Some people are more likely to be addicted to alcohol depending on their genetics. But alcoholism is actually also polygenetic. Poly means many, genetic means has to do with genes. So alcoholism being polygenetic means that there's actually many genes that contribute to alcoholism genetically. And culture also affects alcoholism. If you grow up in a culture that emphasizes use of alcohol for recreational purposes, for spiritual purposes, or whatever it is, you are more likely to be an alcoholic. And, you know, especially if you have those genes. Now, there are cultures that de-emphasize alcohol, like maybe you're Mormon or something like that. And in that case, you're less likely to be an alcoholic, even if you have the gene for being an alcoholic. In my family, there's a bunch of alcoholics. Pretty much my family is just a bunch of alcoholics, especially the males. I suppose, I'm guessing that I probably have the genes for being an alcoholic. My dad's an alcoholic, all my cousins and my uncles, and you know, and practically all the males, okay? And when I drink, I tend to drink too much. So because of my learning, and I've actually studied alcohol, my area of expertise was actually alcohol and aggression. I did experiments on that. And because of what I've learned and what I've studied, I've actually, I try not to consume alcohol that frequently. I will consume alcohol on social occasions, and, you know, but that doesn't happen too often, believe it or not. You know, like when I see my family, maybe 3 times a year or something like that. So I basically managed to not become an alcoholic, okay? Even though my culture emphasizes it and I have the genes, but because of other things that I learned, other things in the environment can also affect whether you're gonna become an alcoholic or not. Nearsightedness, that problem is also genetic and environmental. Your age affects basically, you know, how well you see. As you get older, you're more likely to be nearsighted. Your vision gets worse as you get older. And it's partly genetic, okay? Some people just have genes for better eyesight than others, okay? But even if you have, you know, genes for decent vision like I do, or, you know, at least I think I did, now my vision is worse. Now that I've gotten older, and because my eyesight has been heavily used in reading and studying, and now with all these, you know, handheld devices, all these, you know, the laptops or the iPad and the smartphones and all that stuff, tablets, smartphones, computers, right? All of that is affecting our eyesight. So we're kind of abusing our eyesight. So nearsightedness is basically affected by your age, by your environment, and also your genes, okay? Polygenetic inheritance means that basically there's many genes that will produce a characteristic. Poly means many, genes are genes, so many genes will affect a characteristic. Multifactorial, which many disorders are, means that there's many factors that affect something. So like alcoholism is multifactorial. It involves genes, it involves culture, you know, and it involves, you know, other aspects of the environment. And so does nearsightedness, okay? That's what we mean by that. So genes and the environment interact, okay? So things aren't always as easy as and clear-cut as we think they are. Oh, polygenetic, let me give you another example of something that's polygenetic. Intelligence actually involves many genes, okay? It is not as simple as finding like the gene for intelligence. It's actually very complicated. There are many genes that continue to contribute to intelligence. And intelligence is also multifactorial. It doesn't just involve your genetic predisposition, but also the environment that you're brought up in. You know, whether you have good parenting, you have a good education, all that will affect your intelligence. So luckily, yes, intelligence is complicated, so that, you know, maybe it won't happen so quickly that, that the rich will be able to just, you know, genetically alter their, you know, their children, whether still during prenatal development, and always give themselves intelligent children. There's a fear of that in the future we'll be able to alter genes to such an extent that rich people will be able to pick the best genes for their children, okay, by altering the zygote, which is the fertilized egg, altering the embryo, and then the rest of us would just be stuck with chance, whatever we get, right, according to whatever random thing is happening during prenatal development. There's a fear of that, but luckily things are more complicated than they seem. Intelligence, like I said, very complicated, involves many genes and many factors. So it's not so easy for them to just alter those genes very easily and then give themselves intelligent children all the time. But they already have, you know, a good environment. They're going to get a good education because they're rich. They're going to have maybe, I don't know about the parenting, but at least they can hire people to nurture them properly. So maybe that's far off into the future. But yeah, intelligence is very complicated. You want to have intelligent children? The best way to do that, marry somebody intelligent. And even then, it may not happen. Sex-linked genetic disorders, they're also genetic disorders that are sex-linked, okay? And what that means is that there's a defective gene on the X chromosome. As you guys know, males only have one X chromosome. Males are XY. So if males get the X chromosome with the defective gene, they will express the disorder. It doesn't matter if the disorder is recessive or dominant, or if the gene for the disorder is recessive or dominant. If males get this sex-linked gene, they will have the disorder because it's on the X chromosome and they have no other X, no normal copy of the gene to balance it out, okay? Now, females have two X chromosomes. So if females get one X with a abnormal gene, with the defective gene, they will not express the disorder, okay? So a female with that recessive gene on the X chromosome, they'll be called carriers, okay? So they'll have the defective gene, but they will not have the disorder. They will not express it. An example of that would be color blindness. Color blindness is due to a defective gene that's on the X chromosome. So it's more likely to occur in males because males only have one X. If they get one copy of the gene, they're going to be colorblind. But if females get one copy of the gene, they will not be colorblind. They will be what I call as carriers of the genetic defect. Okay? So color blindness is much more common in males, and so is hemophilia. Hemophilia is also sex-linked, and this is what this is showing you right here. Hemophilia, we have a mother there that has a defective copy, the defective gene on the first X chromosome, and then she has a normal X chromosome. Remember, females are XX. And then we have the father, a normal male there. He has a normal X chromosome and a normal Y chromosome. He doesn't have the gene for being a hemophiliac. Now, hemophilia is a disorder that basically prevents normal blood clotting. So if someone with hemophilia should, get a cut, they would bleed more than normally. So it can be dangerous. So here's the thing. If they have, if these two individuals combine and have children, these are the chances for their offspring, okay? So you can combine the X chromosome with the defective gene with the normal X chromosome for the male. That's the one right there. You'll get a female that's a carrier, okay? A female with a defective gene, but is not a hemophiliac, okay? And then we have a normal female, 2 X's, right? You combine the second X for the female and the first X for the male. That's a normal female, okay? Not a carrier, doesn't have the defective gene, doesn't have hemophilia, okay? And then we combine the first chromosome of the mother with the second chromosome of the father, and that will give you that, right? A male that has hemophilia, a male that has 1 copy of the defective gene, but because it's sex-linked, it's on the X chromosome, that male will be a hemophiliac because he has no other X with the normal version of the gene to cancel it out. And then we combine the second X for the female with the Y for the male, and we get a normal male that is not a hemophiliac. So that's what happens. So sex-linked genetic disorder is a little bit more complicated, but the genes are combined in that same way in the Punnett square, and you also need to know how to do this, okay? So yeah, hopefully you know this, you understand this, and there'll be questions on your homework to test your ability, okay? Let's talk a little bit about reproduction. Reproduction at the actual cellular level. Now there's 2 types, there's mitosis and meiosis. First, the simple kind, which is asexual reproduction. Mitosis is asexual reproduction. And this is where cells just make exact copies of themselves. So cells are duplicated so that the number of chromosomes remains the same. So the cells copy themselves. Each cell has 23 pairs of chromosomes or 46 chromosomes. They copy themselves identically, and and basically, and then you get you get an extra copy. Okay. So those are the kind of cells that make up your muscle, your bone, your skin, your hair, all those things that are not sex cells. Okay. So mitosis is basically normal cellular reproduction, asexual reproduction. It does not involve sex, okay? So it's just normal exact copies of the cells. Your skin, basically, your skin cells, they die all the time. And you're always growing new cells, okay? There's some cells that don't grow up, but for most of your body, the cells are always duplicating themselves, making new skin, new hair, new nails, that kind of stuff. Muscle cells, all that stuff, okay? And the process that involves that creates that is called mitosis. Normal duplication of cells. There are organisms that reproduce in this way through mitosis, and that means that they just make exact copies of themselves, okay? And basically, the organism, the offspring, is exactly genetically and visually and everything like the parent, okay? Moving on, there's also meiosis. Now, meiosis is sexual reproduction. Now, there's an easy way to remember whether it's sexual reproduction or asexual reproduction. Notice meiosis has an E in it, and so does sex. So that's how you can remember meiosis is sexual reproduction. Sexual reproduction is different, a little bit more complicated. Sexual reproduction involves your germ cells or your sex cells, okay, that become the sperm or ovum. Okay, and with meiosis, the number of chromosomes is split in half. Okay, so these are the kind of cells that engage in sexual reproduction are the ones that become sperm or ovum. Okay, now females could only produce ovum. Okay, or ova is plural. Okay, they could only produce ova, and males can only produce sperm. Okay. And this is what happens over here. You can see the image. You start with the parent cell there. It duplicates first, so it doubles the number of chromosomes. From 23 pairs to I guess 46 pairs, and then basically divides in half. So you have 2 exact copies at first. But then those copies then split in half again. No, those copies then split in half so that you only get half the number of chromosomes in the resulting daughter cells. So meiosis is a process, it's sexual reproduction that results in the daughter cells, the cells at the end, right, after reproduction, where they only have half the number of chromosomes. For instance, sperm cells, right? Sperm only has 23 chromosomes. It only provides half of the genetic information needed to make a human. The other half is in the ovum, okay? So sexual reproduction involves a splitting of the cells, okay, twice, okay? First, the genetic information doubles, and then it splits to make two exact copies of the, basically of the mother cell. But then after that, those cells then split in half, and half of the genetic information goes to one cell and the other half goes to the other. Okay, so you end up with half of the genetic information at the end in the resulting daughter cells. And those cells are germ cells that can be, you know, sperm or ova. Okay, but females only produce ova and males can only produce sperm. Okay, so that's meiosis. It's sexual reproduction. Okay, more about reproduction. So the male and female sex cells, I mean, they're called germ cells, but they're also called gametes, okay? Those sex cells, the sperm and the ovum, are called gametes. Those are the sex cells, okay? They're special cells. They, you know, they're different. They only have half of the genetic information, okay? The testes produce sperm, okay? Like I said, males can only produce sperm, okay? Males have testes, okay? That's the male gamete. And ovaries produce, can produce an ovum, or plural would be ova, okay? That's the female gamete, okay? Females can only produce an ovum. They can't produce a sperm, okay? And then, you know, after sex, okay, male and female have sex, and the sperm and ovum can fuse together to create a zygote, to create a fertilized egg, basically, okay? Half the genetic information comes from the sperm, half from the ovum, and that will give you the 46 chromosomes, or 23 pairs of chromosomes that you need to make a full human being, okay? Half from the sperm and half from the ovum. So here's an image for you guys to show you. So you have the cells there, right, with half the genetic information. And then so that's A. B, you see one of them has a little tail, so that's the sperm, right? That's the male gamete, and then we have the ovum that doesn't have a tail. And those two will combine to give you a zygote, a fertilized egg, okay? You could call it an egg. Basically that has the 46 chromosomes to make a complete human being, okay? And this is all kind of obvious stuff. It might sound a little bit complicated, but you probably already knew that, okay? So that's sexual reproduction. Now this zygote, this fertilized egg, can lead to, you know, to basically monozygotic twins or dizygotic twins, okay? So when the zygote splits and makes an exact copy of itself, you end up with what are called monozygotic twins. Monozygotic twins share 100% of their DNA, okay? They are identical at the beginning. Their genetic information is identical, so they should look pretty much exactly the same. Now, I will tell you that as they get older, there will be mutations, okay? And there will be errors in the copying of the genetic information. And then eventually you will be able to tell them apart. And if they should live to a ripe old age, these identical twins, these monozygotic twins, you'll see that when they're like, you know, 70, 80 years old, if they should live that long, or they're senior citizens, you will be able to tell them apart. They will not look identical anymore, but they will look, you know, almost exactly the same, but one might be a little taller, one's face might be a little bit different. They will be different. They will not be identical when they're older, okay? But you start out identically, assuming there are no errors to begin with. They start out sharing 100% of their DNA. That's when the zygote splits in half and makes two exact copies of itself, and then you have two exact, basically, zygotes developing in the mother's womb, and you'll have two babies being born that are identical, the monozygotic twins. Now, there's also dizygotic twins, okay? They only share 50% of their DNA. I know the image there is blocking the 50%, a little bit. Like I said, when I present on my iPad, it moves the images around a little bit. It alters things a little bit. So they share 50% of their DNA. Now, you share 50% of your DNA with your brother or your sister. If you have a sibling, you know, as long as you have the same mother and father, you have the exact same, you have 50% of the exact same DNA that they do. Okay, so with dizygotic twins, they also share 50% of their DNA, but they also share the womb, so they have a little bit more of a connection, right? And they're born at a very similar time. But just like regular brother, sister, or brother and sister, they only share 50% of their DNA, so they won't look exactly the same. They're also called fraternal twins, okay? And it's about 1 in 60 conceptions naturally. That may differ nowadays. I forgot to mention, for monozygotic twins, it's only about 1 in 250 conceptions. Now, twins do happen a lot more frequently now. Dizygotic twins and even monozygotic twins. And the reason for that is because there's a lot of fertility methods now. Couples that have trouble conceiving, trouble, you know, having a child, they can, you know, pay for, or if they have insurance that might cover it, they can have, you know, undergo certain fertility treatments, and that increases the chances of having twins. So it happens a lot more often now. The chances of having twins now, or like basically identical twins, is like 1 in 10 now, okay? And it's because of those fertility treatments. That's what happens. Oh, I want to mention also with dizygotic twins, what happens there is that the female releases not 1 ovum at a time, but actually 2, and then those ovum those ovum are actually then fertilized by 2 different sperm, and then you have 2 zygotes developing in the mother's womb, going to be the mother's womb at the same time. But it's 2 different ovum, 2 different sperm. They're only 50% identical, just like regular brother and sister. You get half your genetic information from your dad and half from your mom, okay? And dizygotic twins only share 50% of their information, their genetic information. Okay, let's keep going. More about reproduction. Now, there's other things that, that ensure that there's more diversity when it comes to reproduction, okay? Twins, like I said, naturally are not that common, monozygotic twins and dizygotic twins. But when it comes to meiosis, this sexual reproduction that combines different sperm and different ovum, there's actually 8 million different possibilities. 8 different chromosomally different sperm and ova are possible, okay, 8 million. And then there's also something known as crossing over, where you can see in the image here on the right, it explains it step by step, where you have basically chromosomes there, and then they duplicate themselves, and then they exchange, third step there, they exchange pieces of genetic information. They exchange segments. That crossing over where they exchange pieces of genetic information increases the variation. So by the time all these things happen, there's actually 64 trillion possible combinations, 64 trillion possible zygotes. Think about that. What that means is that if you, assuming you do not have an identical twin, there's probably never has been anyone exactly like you. You are completely unique. Now, if you have an identical twin, that means there is someone just like you, but that happens because the zygote split, okay? But other than that, if that doesn't happen, the chances of somebody being identical to you are 1 in 64 trillion. So there never probably has been anyone exactly like you, and there probably never will be. We'll probably be extinct by the time that there's been that many people, okay? Assuming that at some point we're wiped out by some asteroid or something that hits the Earth, okay? Mutations will create even more variations. But if they happened during prenatal development, they can be lethal to the zygote and can cause the zygote to then be aborted, and basically, you know, and then you don't have a living human being born, okay? Let's keep going. Let's talk about gender determination. What determines your gender? Okay, whether, you know, or actually in this case, I'm talking more about your sex here. Often we use gender and sex interchangeably, but those things are actually not the same thing. And when we get further into the semester, we will talk about the difference between gender and sex, okay? But we're talking about the genetic level, so we're talking about sex. So as we know, the ovum, the female gamete, only contributes an X chromosome. The interesting thing is that the sperm that the male produces, the sperm can carry an X chromosome or a Y chromosome, okay? Remember, it carries 23 chromosomes. It carries half of the genetic information to make a human. And the ovum also carries the other half, the other 23 chromosomes. But remember, the 23rd pair is the one that determines your sex, okay? So the ovum can only contribute an X, and females produce ovum. So women can only contribute an X chromosome, okay? For males, their sperm that tries to fertilize the ovum can carry an X or a Y. So what that means is that it is the male, okay? It is the father that determines the sex of the child, because the mother could only contribute an X. The father will give either an X or a Y. If he gives an X, there'll be a female. If he gives a Y, it's a male. It's the father, right, that produces sperm. It's the sperm that carries either an X or Y. So only the father can determine the sex of the child. And if you remember, some of you might remember a little bit of history where there was that King Henry VIII, known as Henry VIII. He beheaded several of his wives, had them beheaded, had them killed, because he wanted a male heir to the throne, but he kept getting females. And he blamed his wives, and he had several of them beheaded. And as a matter of fact, it's actually his fault that he was getting females, not her fault. Okay, still a very messed up thing to do, but just to give you a little bit of context there. And another thing I want to tell you about determining the sex of a child is that the sperm with the Y chromosome is actually lighter and faster. The Y chromosome is smaller than the X chromosome. So therefore, the sperm that has the Y chromosome will be a little bit lighter and therefore swim a little bit faster, and is more likely to reach the ovum before the other sperm. Okay. So you're more likely to have basically more conceptions that will be male than female. So there's 160 males conceived, okay, for every 100 females. What that means is that basically when the sperm fertilizes the ovum and you get a zygote, 160 times, 160 for 160 will be male, and about 100 will be female. So basically you'll get 1.6 males for every one female, okay? So there's more males conceived than females. But the problem is that males are more likely to be aborted spontaneously. They're more likely to have defects at the genetic and chromosomal level, and they're therefore more likely to be rejected by the female body, and more likely to be spontaneously aborted. So by the time you get to birth, there's about 105 males born for every 100 females, okay? And then once the child is born, once you do have this newborn, it turns out that female babies are actually more resistant to disease, more resistant to changes in the environment than males. Female babies are actually stronger than the female babies, believe it or not. They grow, if you've noticed, they grow faster. They're usually healthier than males. So the male babies are actually more likely to die during infancy than females. So that kind of evens the odds. And then as you get older, when you become adults, males are more likely to sign up for the military and go off to war and get killed. Males are more likely to get into fights and be aggressive, more likely to break the law and get into fights and drive too fast and do things that get them killed than females. So by the time you get to adulthood, you'll have more females than males, which means that females have to compete a little bit more for a male partner if you're heterosexual, okay? You have to compete a little bit more than the males do because there's less males than there are actual females. And especially in war-torn countries where a lot of the males die. Okay, there'll be a lot more females than males. I mentioned before that fertility methods can result in more twins, usually more fraternal twins, but also, you know, can result in more identical twins as well, because the zygote is more likely to split as well. Some of you may have heard of the octomom there. There's a picture of the octomom. She had octuplets, if I'm saying that correctly, octuplets. She basically had 8 zygotes, 8 embryos, and eventually became fetuses. She gave birth to 8 children, okay? 8 developing embryos, 8 embryos developing inside her at the same time, okay? What happened is she underwent in vitro fertilization, had trouble conceiving, so she used this fertility method where they had the husband's sperm mixed with her ova outside of the womb in like the petri dish, okay? And basically, and you know, and then that produced the zygote, the fertilized egg, basically. And they always produce many of them, and they actually will put several inside the mother, because sometimes the zygotes will not survive, or they'll be spontaneously aborted. So you want to put more than one in there to basically increase the chances of actually being able to have a child, being able to conceive a child, okay? So the octomom, they produce 8 for her, 8 of these zygotes with her husband's sperm and her ova, and they put 8 inside her, and all of them survived. So she basically had 8 children, okay? And she became famous for that. And then, of course, they also blamed her for a lot of things, and they gave her a lot of trouble, okay, in the media and things like that. They followed her around, they harassed her. But these things are more likely to happen. Having triplets and octuplets and even twins is more common if you have if you undergo these assisted reproduction methods. Okay, there are legal restrictions in some countries that may not make this possible. There's other assisted reproductive methods there. I know that's kind of small. Your book doesn't really mention all of these, so I decided to look them up and put them there for you in case you're interested. Okay, there's all kinds of ways that you know, you can help couples conceive a child. I want to mention the last one that's kind of interesting: surrogacy, or having a gestational host. That is where basically another woman agrees to carry the child for the parents, and agrees to give birth to the child, and then gives up the child to the parent. Now, there's several ways in which that can be done. They could have, you know, a zygote, a fertilized egg, using the mother's sperm and the father's sperm implanted into the surrogate, and then she gives birth and gives up the child. Or what they can do is, the wife can decide and agree that the husband can have sex with that other woman, impregnate her, and then give birth to a child that that surrogate then gives up to to the mother. I mean, to the original, the person who wanted to be a mother who couldn't conceive. Okay, and that's it, you guys. I'm gonna stop recording now.